Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this latest lecture in our series on the First World War. And I'm Richard Evans. I'm also Provost of Gresham College. And it falls to me to talk about war and politics in relation to the First World War. And I put up the famous quote there by the Prussian military theorist of the Napoleonic era, Karl von Clausewitz, who famously observed that war is the continuation of politics by other means. And that means, of course, that you don't fight a war for its own sake. It's in Clausewitz's view that war is an instrument of policy to be used to achieve specific aims and purposes. A perfect example of how this dictum worked out in practice could be found in Bismarck's wars of the 1860s. Of course, Bismarck and all the Prussian generals all been reading Clausewitz. It was part of general education in Prussia. And Bismarck's wars were aimed to achieve German unification under Prussian leadership, because Germany in the 1860s was a kind of collection of 39 states under a very loose organization called the German Confederation. And in each case of his wars, the war against Denmark in 1864, against Austria in 1866, and against France then in 1870, Bismarck provided a retrospective illustration of another famous dictum, this time from a French politician, from indeed Georges Clemenceau, during the First World War. Clemenceau famously said, "War is too serious a matter to be left to the soldiers." And after the rapid victory of the Prussian armies over their Austrian opponents at the Battle of Königgrätz in 1866, the generals, flushed with victory, unexpected victory and complete victory, were keen to push on to Vienna. But in a series of heated arguments, that's Clemenceau, in a series of heated arguments, Bismarck stopped them. He convinced the Prussian king, Wilhelm I, that the aim of expelling Austria from the German Confederation and founding a new North German Confederation under Prussian leadership had been achieved, and it was not necessary to go any further. Indeed, politically very dangerous, since the new Germany did not want to make an enemy out of the Austrians. Having the French as an enemy was bad enough. Now, in his relationship with Bismarck, Wilhelm I always gave in to his chancellor's tantrums and threats of resignation. As he once said, "It's tough being Kaiser under Bismarck." But his grandson, the headstrong Wilhelm II, who succeeded in 1888, had other ideas. Within 2 years, he'd got rid of Bismarck and embarked on a course of his own, building a big navy designed to challenge the British in the North Sea and open the way to the enlargement of Germany's rather miserable little colonial empire. Here's the famous cartoon in Punch by Sir John Tenniel called "Dropping the Pilot." There's Bismarck, the pilot who steered Germany into existence. There's the Kaiser looking extremely casual and supercilious, watching him go down the steps as he's ready to sail the ship of state into uncharted waters. Unlike Bismarck, who coined another famous phrase, "Politics is the art of the possible," and if you ever see any dictionaries or quotations which ascribe that to R.A. Butler, they're wrong. He pinched it from Bismarck. He also said the art of statesmanship is to steer a course on the stream of time. So in other words, Bismarck thought that the art of statesmanship was really to recognize the way things were moving and try and take advantage of them. And he knew that nationalism was the great force of the 19th century. You couldn't, as it were, row against it. You had to go with it. And he used it to set up the new Germany the way he wanted it. But unlike Bismarck, who spent the 1870s and 1880s consolidating the new Germany's position internationally with a precarious house of cards of alliances, The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, had no idea how precarious the new Germany's position in the world was, or how dangerous it would be to upset the European status quo without a clear political reason for doing so and a rational strategy for putting his policy into operation. Just over a quarter of a century after Wilhelm II's accession to the throne, Britain and Germany were at war. Now, Clausewitz also observed that policy objectives often became obscured in what he called the fog of war. Armed conflict tended to develop its own logic. Military events frequently took an unexpected turn. It required a strong hand to keep the generals under control. And indeed, the elder Moltke, the victor of 1866 and 1870, observed that the first thing any general had to do in a battle was to tear up his plans and make it up as he went along, as the situation developed. Already in Clausewitz's time, the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars had demonstrated the power of ideology, political ideas of the French Revolution to inspire a lust for conquest. But after Waterloo in 1815, so great was the general fear in Europe of revolutionary wars breaking out again, with all their destructiveness, that right through the 19th century, the major powers got together time and again in what became known as the Concert of Europe to solve international problems, keep the balance of power, and put the lid on popular revolutions. Now, in the 18th century, Europe's wars were global in scale, with Anglo-French rivalry fought out in India and America, as well as on the European continent. After 1815, by contrast, Britain's world hegemony, underpinned by the unchallenged power of the Royal Navy and the Industrial Revolution in Britain, helped ensure that European conflicts remained limited in scope. As a result, all the armed conflicts Europe experienced between 1815 and 1914, here's a hostile American cartoon of the British power in the 19th century, but all the European conflicts of the 19th century were short in duration. They involved only a handful of combatant nations. They were fought within a very restricted geographical area. The Russian-Turkish wars of the 1820s and 1870s, the suppression of the 1848 revolution, the Crimean War, wars of Italian-German unification, all of these were eventually brought to an end, either by concerted international action or because the victorious side had clear and limited aims which it achieved. Here's another octopus suggesting the danger of Russia. This is a French map from 1877 about the Russo-Turkish War, which was brought to an end after a short space of time by an concerted international action to push the Russians back from their ambitions to get an outlet to the Mediterranean. Now, the states that fought these wars are obviously prompted to reform themselves to improve their effectiveness. So Russia, for example, after the Crimean War, for its defeat, embarked on a major series of reforms, the abolition of serfdom, creation of new government ministries, reform of the army, and so on. In fact, 19th century wars often brought about regime change, as in the unification of Italy and Germany, or the creation of the Third Republic in France after the defeat of the Second Empire, Napoleon III, by the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. But beneath these changes, there's a great deal of continuity, as the central political institutions of one regime were carried on into the next. So you can think of, for example, the electoral system in France, which was carried over from the Second Empire into the Third Republic, the hegemony of Prussian institutional structures, which was carried over first into the North German Confederation and then to United German Empire, the absolutist power of the Tsar, which survived the institutional reforms of the 1860s. So there are reforms and changes, but there's a lot of continuity as well. Now, this is a rather lengthy preface to what I'm going to say, because clearly the war that broke out in 1914 broke with this long-established pattern. It broke with everything that Europeans had been familiar with in the 19th century in the experience of the relationship of war and politics. First of all, the war that broke out in 1914 lasted for more than 4 years, longer than any other war. All the other wars in the 19th century lasted 2 or they were even shorter. In the case of Bismarck's wars, just a few weeks. It was fought not just in a limited area of Europe, like the 19th century wars, but it was fought in numerous locations across the globe. It defied all attempts to limit it or bring it to an end until one side finally was forced to concede defeat. So war between 1914 and 1918 escaped the control of politics and began very quickly to exert its own momentum until its actual effects on politics were profound, even cataclysmic. 4 great empires collapsed and were replaced by radically different political regimes. The Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Here you see a kind of before and after map. You can see here the major changes in Central Europe. Germany becomes smaller. Poland comes into existence. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. You can see how the Austro-Hungary is broken up into Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia. Romania becomes bigger. The Turks, the Ottoman Empire, is pushed substantially out of Europe. So, this is the Great War. In other words, as it was known until the Second World War, the Great War was unprecedented in scale and scope, something completely new. And it reversed the relationship between war and politics, which Clausewitz had laid down as the most fruitful one. So, why did the European order of the 19th century break down and give way to 4 years of unrestrained global conflict involving almost every nation on the European continent and others outside, including Japan and eventually America? So, was this some kind of parallel? Was there a parallel of some sort with events in the present day? There was a lot of writing and speculation last year as the anniversary came up about a rising power Germany in 1914 challenging a declining empire Britain. Now people said it was China challenging America. Then as now, nationalism was on the rise. Then as now, border disputes such as the dispute between China and Japan threatened to escalate into wider conflicts, or in the Middle East, or a century ago in Morocco. But these parallels, I think, are specious. The main reason for this, I think, lies in the enormous differences in the international order between 1914 and 2014. So if you go back to the turn of the century, this is a First World War poster making fun of Wilhelm II. The concert of Europe began to break down. The rising power of Germany refused to play by the rules of the concert of Europe, and it threw its weight around in the search for colonies, what Wilhelm II and his chancellor, Bernhard von Bülow, called Weltpolitik, or world policy, the search, as Bülow said, for a place in the sun for imperial Germany. And remember, German colonies were Southwest Africa, now Namibia, Tanganyika, now Tanzania, Togoland, Cameroon, a little chunk of New Guinea, and some islands in the Pacific called the Bismarck Archipelago. This clearly wasn't enough for the leaders of Germany compared to the enormous world empires of the French and the British, or even the Portuguese. So a naval arms race with Britain ensued. Nothing like it had ever happened before. In 1905, Tsarist Russia was humiliatingly defeated in a war with Japan and turned its attention back to the European theatre. It expanded through the late 19th century to Vladivostok and then down into Manchuria on the Pacific, but it was now defeated by a war in a war with Japan, to everybody's absolute surprise. Actually, when I was teaching at the University of East Anglia, an elderly and rather deaf professor in the next room was holding a class, and the walls are rather thin, and since he'd been an interrogator in the Second World War, he taught by interrogation, and he asked, they were doing the Russo-Japanese War, and he asked the students, so why did he's a German-Jewish professor, why did the Japanese defeat the Russians in the war between Japan and Russia? Why did they have a naval victory? And eventually a girl piped up and said, well, Professor, perhaps it's because they had more efficient ships. He said, what? More efficient ships? What has... and then... So one heard the most extraordinary things in a new university. Well, what this did was it pushed the Russians, turned them away from the Pacific and turned their attention back to Europe. And Austria-Hungary is becoming more and more nervous with the rise of Balkan and Slav nationalism within its borders. The French were still thirsting for revenge for the defeat of 1871 by the Germans. So these powers all now looked for alliances to strengthen their respective positions. And soon Europe was divided into two armed camps: the Triple Alliance of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy, and the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. This was, I think, in some ways parallel to the situation in Europe between 1947 and 1989, when again two armed camps faced each other in the Cold War. But in 1914, Europeans had what seemed to us, I think, to be an irresponsibly positive attitude to war after decades of peace. War, it was widely thought in 1914, would be an adventure. It would be like a duel fought to assert manliness and honor, only on a much bigger scale. Remember, dueling was common right across Europe, and many novels you probably know which feature duels. Many politicians, Stolypin, the Russian prime minister, Clemenceau, many others fought duels. This time it was mostly by pistols at 10 paces or 20 paces, according to how severe the quarrel was. Only in Britain did you prove your manliness in a different way, in other words, on the cricket pitch, which is the same effect, a small, hard, round object coming towards you very fast. This positive attitude towards war was added to by social Darwinism, as politicians and statesmen increasingly saw international relations in terms of the survival of the fittest nation in the competition for supremacy. And there's plenty of documentation of European statesmen thinking in these terms. The Second World War, of course, discredited such ideas. The coming of the atom bomb made politicians and peoples much more cautious about launching major armed conflicts. But in 1914, they could look back on European wars in the 19th century and think that they were not terribly destructive. Why should the next war be destructive as well? Well, since 1989, we have moved from a bipolar world in the Cold War through a brief unipolar period in the 90s to now an increasingly multipolar world. And this kind of reverses the developments that characterized the years before 1914. Years before 1914, Europe was moving from the unipolar world dominated by Britain to a multipolar situation, and then finally a bipolar world between the two major alliance systems. And of course, the key to 1914 is that a local conflict triggers a much bigger one. And this is much easier, much more possible, or likely even, when you have a bipolar system of alliances. But it's much less likely when there are several different players in the power game of international politics. And this is an American cartoon, a rather good one, I think, of how the First World War began with a small quarrel beginning. Each side backs its clients, and you have a major war. And of course, the international cooperation that had faded away with the demise of the concert of Europe before 1914 and its the division of Europe revived after 1945 and is still in existence today in many institutions from the United Nations to the European Union. And conflict resolution mechanisms exist at many levels, as they did under the concert of Europe, but not from the turn of the century in this new bipolar system. Well, the biggest difference between then and now lies, I think, in the fact that the First World War was not a war between European states. It was a war between multinational states, but above all, a war between global empires. The scramble for Africa that began in the 1880s and extended to other parts of the world, most notably the Pacific, took some time to convert the territories carried out by drawing lines on the map in conferences in Europe into real colonies. In Africa, the Ashanti Wars between the Ashanti and the British in West Africa, there were 9 of them, I think, and they lasted until the final British victory at the end of the century. The British were tangling here with an advanced and militarily effective African empire, which took a very long time to subjugate. The Boers in South Africa were only brought under full British rule in 1902. The Germans established control in East and West Africa in genocidal wars against the indigenous inhabitants, which finished only in 1907. The Belgians established their cruel and sadistic rule over the Congo around the same time. The Russians at this time were still constructing the Trans-Siberian Railway to develop their recently conquered territories in Central and Eastern Asia. And the European powers came to the realization that they would not be able to conquer China only during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, which created so much hostility and opposition, it became clear the costs of invading and dividing up the decaying Chinese empire would be prohibitive. So the colonial map of the world, in other words, in real terms, was only completed at the beginning of the 20th century. And from this point onwards, in this age of imperialism and colonization, it was clear that new colonies could only be acquired by seizing them from other powers. Chief of these other powers, of course, was the decaying Ottoman Empire, which still controlled most of the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. And the fuse that detonated the explosion of August 1914 was laid by the Italian invasion and annexation of the Ottoman province of Libya and the Dodecanese islands off the Anatolian coast 3 years before 1914. Italian success in Libya convinced the emerging Balkan nations that the time had come for them to achieve independence or increase and consolidate their recently won nationhood. And in the 2 Balkan Wars of 1912 to 13, the Balkan nations, you can see them there on the map, including Greece, seized most of the Balkans from the Ottoman Empire, leaving them only a tiny piece of territory west of Istanbul, and then fought each other, the Second Balkan War, over the spoils. Now, the First Balkan War When Montenegro, in alliance with Serbia, attacked northern Albania, Italy and Austria-Hungary demanded their withdrawal. Russia began to mobilize in support of the Serbs. France declared its support for the Russians. So already you can see in the First Balkan War in 1912, this situation building up where other powers were sucked into these conflicts. And it was only diffused by a British intervention, resulting in a general international conference that guaranteed independence for Albania. And this is an ominous kind of rehearsal for what happened in August 1914. Now, in the intervening period, the attention of Serb nationalists turned to Bosnia with its substantial population of ethnic Serbs. In 1908, it had been incorporated into the Habsburg monarchy in a unilateral act of annexation that aroused fierce passions among Serb nationalists. And of course, the Austrians did this in order to try and calm the situation and stop Serb nationalism extending to within their borders. And one particular Serb nationalist group, the so-called Black Hand, a terrorist movement that in fact committed numerous atrocities during the Balkan Wars, took the opportunity to express this outrage by sponsoring the assassination of the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, on the 20th of June 1914, as he and his wife visited Sarajevo. Now, the Austrians were determined on invading Serbia from the start, desperately worried about the stability of their rule over the South Slavs, unless, as they said, they taught the Serbs a lesson. But the sense of weakness that fueled Austrian aggression also made the Austrians aware that it would be unwise to do this unless they had backing from Berlin. The German government, without other major allies in Europe, apart from the fickle and unreliable Italians, who indeed did refuse to come in on their side in 1914 and came on the other side some months later, the German government agreed on the 6th of July to issue the famous blank check to the Austrians, promising unconditional support. However, it's pretty clear nobody at the time thought the Russians would actually intervene. They weren't ready. They were building up their armed forces, their arms and equipment and munitions, and their mobilization plans and so on would not be really ready until 1917. And the Russians had backed down in the previous Balkan crisis I've just described of the year before. 1912 to 13, they'd eventually back down after British mediation. And surely the Russians would not back a regicide. They would not come in the side of somebody, a power, or its clients or emissaries who had killed the heir to a throne. And I don't think there's any evidence for the claim that the Germans were using the crisis as an excuse for war with the Russians, still less with the French. Well, on the 28th of June, it wasn't until late July that the European powers began to be aware of the danger of the conflict in the Balkans escalating. On the 21st of July, Bethmann Hollweg, the German Chancellor, told his ambassadors, "We urgently desire a localization of the conflict." Even Army Chief von Moltke, with the Kaiser, thought the Austrians could beat the Serbs in a few days, then make peace quickly. He said that on the 13th of July. But the Austrians did not act quickly, which is the main condition for localization. Austrian Habsburg rule was once described famously as absolutism tempered by inefficiency. And this was certainly the case in this crisis. It wasn't until the 23rd of July, the Austrian government, having taken weeks to secure the necessary agreement of its Hungarian counterpart, issued an ultimatum to the Serbs to find and punish the assassins. The Serbs indicated their willingness to give in on almost all points. When, on the 27th of July, the Kaiser learned of the Serb response to the ultimatum, he wrote, "This does away with any need for war." But in fact, of course, the ultimatum was an excuse for war, designed to be unacceptable. And even a slight equivocation in the response, and there was a good deal of it in the response from the Serbs, would be taken in Vienna as a no and as a pretext for invasion, which is exactly what happened. Now, British opinion was initially pro-Austrian. blaming the Serbs, saying they had to arrest the perpetrators of the assassination. Prime Minister Asquith, preoccupied with Ulster, still thought the UK would not be involved as late as the 24th of July. The press agreed. It would be ridiculous to get involved in this obscure quarrel. While the French pressed the Russians to stand firm behind Serbia during a long-planned French official visit to Russia, the Montenegrin princesses, married to two key Grand Dukes in Tsar Nicholas II's entourage, kept telling them, "You're going to get back Alsace-Lorraine. Germany will be destroyed." The French government clearly saw its opportunity to get revenge for 1871. And on the 23rd of July, Russia and France agreed to defend Serbia. But this failed in its aim of stopping the Austrians from pressing on. They had no plan B. Their only plan was to invade. The ultimatum expired on the 25th of July. Austria mobilized on the 28th. The Serbs had already mobilized. Russian leaders were keen to sublimate mounting contempt and terrorism at home. I think the average life expectancy of a Russian government minister at this time was about 8 months, I think, into a patriotic crusade abroad. And when the Russians started partial mobilization on the 29th of July, the German leadership panicked. The German Schlieffen Plan, named after the former chief of the General Staff, Alfred Schlieffen, was designed to eliminate France before turning to Russia, which is notoriously slow to mobilize. And this plan swung into action. The German army marched into Belgium with the intention of encircling Paris from the west, pinning up the French armies against the frontier from behind, in a classic maneuver of encirclement. The French and the Russians had told Grey, the foreign minister in London, that a clear British declaration of support would deter the Germans. But the British cabinet wouldn't allow this. At a meeting on the 27th of July, 3/4 of cabinet ministers opposed entering a war unless Britain was directly attacked. Only on the 2nd of August did Grey persuade the cabinet that invasion of France and violation of Belgian neutrality would be a casus belli, a reason for going to war. And in the cabinet, the threat of Grey and Asquith resigning if this didn't happen was crucial. When civil war was threatening in Ireland, suffragette outrages were mounting at home, the breakup of the government could not be contemplated. So the reasoning behind the British decision to go to war can't be reduced to a simple response to German aggression. The naval arms race is no longer an issue by 1914. It had been won decisively by the British with the construction of the dreadnought class of heavily armed battleships, which is a major reason why the German government switched funding to the expansion of the land army in 1913. And to British politicians and civil servants, whatever some present-day politicians have claimed, the threat was not a German challenge to Western democratic values. It was a more general threat to Britain's position in the world. On the 25th of July, Sir Eyre Crowe, a senior Foreign Office Mandarin, advised, should the war come and England stand aside, one of two things must happen. One, either Germany and Austria win, crush France, and humiliate Russia. What will then be the position of a friendless England? Or two, France and Russia win. What would then be their attitude towards England? What about India and the Mediterranean? So the war, in this sense, one goes with Crowe's advice, was fought as much to tame Russia and France as to oppose German aggression. And here you have a British cartoon about British fears of the Russian bear making further advances towards Egypt and the Middle East. Or here you have then colonial conflicts over Morocco, again, fear of the French. What strikes one about this chain of events is how none of the powers involved was actively working for a general war of conquest and aggrandizement. Even the Austrians, the most belligerent of the European states in the crisis, acted on the assumption that they would be left alone to conquer the Serbs. They and the Germans assumed the Russians would not intervene. The Germans assumed the British would not intervene. But efforts to localize the conflict, in contrast to the Balkan crisis of 1912 to 13, were very half-hearted. By the time it became clear that decisive mediation was needed, events had gone too far. Muddle and confusion reigned. And as the politicians dithered and squabbled, the military took over, pushing for mobilization in the belief that their moment had come. So the First World War was not politics continued by other means. Not one single state in Europe began it with clearly formulated war aims or had any concerted or organized vision of how it wanted it to end. Once the war had started, however, the belligerent nations quickly began to decide what they wanted from the conflict. And the most famous set of war aims was the German September program, which was discovered in the German archives after the Second World War by the German historian Fritz Fischer, with whom indeed I studied some time afterwards in Hamburg, and his whole entourage of assistants and students had something of a crusading atmosphere of uncovering the huge extent of German war aims which had been concealed up to that point. Here we have the September program. As you can see, they're going to annex substantial areas or tie them economically to Germany. They're going to be satellite states. It's going to be complete European domination. Germany is going to be extended to include key industrial areas like Lorraine, Longwy-Brie, Luxembourg, key parts of Polish industry, and so on. It was a bid for world power, said Fischer, and it included demands for huge annexations overseas as well. But it never actually became official policy. Here you have the African aims, again, aggrandizing, creating a kind of German empire in Africa. But none of this is actually official policy. Fischer showed war aims are constantly disputed and debated at Germany. Hardline annexationists, such as the people who produced this map, were clashing with those who only wanted limited gains, or indeed, like the Social Democrats, the Marxist, largest political party in Germany, the Marxists wanted no annexations at all. Kaiser's Germany was not a dictatorship. Any government required the assent of the elected national legislature, the Reichstag, for its policies. And the largest party was the Social Democrats, who wanted a peace without annexations. Now, for them, this was a defensive war waged against the threat of the Tsarist Russian dictatorship, a regime they saw as backward, barbarous, anti-Semitic, and anti-democratic. And here you have on the 28th of July, still at this late hour, massive socialist demonstrations in Germany against war. It was only when they were persuaded that it was a defensive war against the Russian Tsarist despotism that they changed their minds and supported war credits. Russia, along with France, was Britain's principal ally in the war, a fact that gives the lie to claims that the war was fought from the beginning in defense of Western values and democratic freedoms. Here is a very hostile cartoon of the Russian dictatorship. Not only was Germany a good deal more democratic than and free than Russia, but Britain itself, I think, the restricted franchise meant that only that about 40% of adult males, including probably a majority of the soldiers who fought on the Western Front, did not have the right to vote. What these men believed they were fighting for, as their letters suggest, was Britain and the British Empire. And in fact, the Great War was a global war. 630,000 Canadian troops enlisted, 412,000 Australians, 1,450,000 Indians, 128,000 New Zealanders, 136,000 South Africans, and many of these, including Indians, fought on the Western Front. 160,000 British colonial troops with 1 million bearers to carry their ammunition and so on fought the Germans in East Africa. In fact, most of the Indian troops fought the Ottomans in Mesopotamia. There's about 150,000 on the Western Front. The French sent large numbers of African troops to Europe, including 173,000 soldiers from Algeria, 134,000 from West Africa, 60,000 from Tunisia, 44,000 from Indochina, 37,000 from Morocco, 34,000 from Madagascar. The Russians, of course, deployed large numbers of troops from their provinces in Central Asia. So even in Europe, this was a global war. But it was fought too in Africa, the Pacific, and the Middle East. Here's an inspection of Senegalese troops by the French, for example. The Germans lost almost all their colonies immediately. French, British, and colonial forces conquered Namibia, Cameroon, and other German territories, except for Tanganyika, where a German force held out for much longer in a campaign described entertainingly in William Boyd's novel An Ice Cream War, and in the classic film, which you may know, starring Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart, The African Queen. And another movie, Lawrence of Arabia, reminds us of the conflict in the Ottoman provinces of the Middle East. And of course, the disaster at Gallipoli is etched starkly on public memory in Australia and New Zealand. It's often forgotten that Japan was an ally of Britain in the Great War and joined in the siege of Tsingtao, a German treaty port in China, now mainly known across the world as the site of the Tsingtao Brewery, which produces a lager originally known before the First World War by the name of Germania. Japanese and Australian forces cooperated in the capture of the German colony of Kaiser Wilhelm's Land in northeastern New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago. For the Japanese, this was an opportunity to test once more their military efficiency against European armies, an aim they achieved sufficiently well to instill a belief in them that they could do the same thing on a much larger scale in the future. Virtually almost the only part of the globe, inhabited part of the globe, at any rate, not involved in the conflict, were the Americas. And that changed, of course, on the 6th of April, 1917, when the United States entered the war on the Allied side. The main reasons behind the USA's abandonment of neutrality were the German declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare on the 9th of January, which is designed to stop supplies reaching Britain, no matter, even if they were carried in neutral American ships, and the interception and publication of the Zimmermann telegram, in which the German foreign minister offered Mexico help in reconquering Texas and the southwestern states in return for a military alliance with the Central Powers. US President Woodrow Wilson felt able to declare war at this point in April 1917 because the February Revolution in Russia had toppled Tsarist despotism and ushered in what looked likely to be a new democratic political system. Here's a portrait of the Tsar being thrown by the revolutionaries onto the fire. But this was, of course, a liberal revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution didn't happen until much later in the year. And this transformed the politics of the war by enabling the Allies to declare that it was a struggle for democratic values and a fight to build a better world. Now, this is the crucial turning point. It had been, in that sense, an embarrassment for the Western Allies that the Tsarist despotism had been their main ally. But now, Tsarist Russia was no longer. There was a republic, and it was enshrining democratic and liberal values. So that changed the politics of the war in the largest sense. And less than a year later, in January 1918, when the situation in Russia was still very unclear, Wilson's 14 points proclaimed the freedom of the seas, international cooperation, open diplomacy, the autonomy of the constituent nations of the Habsburg Empire, the creation of a new Polish state, and the establishment of a League of Nations. All these things Wilson proclaimed were major war aims now in what was presented as a moral and political as well as a military struggle. These events, of course, had to be seen as part of a wider crisis in the conduct of the war. The war placed enormous, unprecedented, unsuspected military, economic, and administrative strains on the combatant nations. And these strains reached breaking point towards the end of 1916. Nobody expected it to go on so long and to be so enormously expensive in every sense of the word in terms of lives, nations, economy, and social order. And it was clear that the war required more vigorous and more determined leadership if the stalemate on the Western Front was to be broken. Not only was the military situation difficult, but the morale of civilians is suffering too. And this is especially the case in Germany and Austria-Hungary, where the Allied blockade was producing serious malnutrition and major food riots. In the end, in fact, over 500,000 Germans died of malnutrition as a result of the blockade. In August 1916, Paul von Hindenburg took over as chief of the German General Staff, largely acting as a popular figurehead, while the actual direction of the war was taken over by the Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff. New efforts were made to centralize and boost war production with the Hindenburg program, while it was largely Ludendorff, here on the right, who pushed forward the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. And the Kaiser and the civilian government were effectively sidelined by the new military leadership. At the same time, the social democratic opposition in Germany split into moderate and radical factions, while the Catholic Centre Party and the Liberals collaborated with the majority socialists in a joint parliamentary committee to push for political and electoral reform. And in the spring of 1917, the Kaiser, as a kind of yielding to this pressure and as a sort of riposte to the new democratic program of the Allies, issued his Easter proclamation at the prompting of Ludendorff, promising the introduction of universal and equal suffrage, manhood suffrage in Prussia, which has covered a larger part of the German Empire. So political reform here was being driven by military necessity. Ludendorff did not believe in democracy at all. In fact, his political views were extremely strange, particularly after he came under the influence of his second wife, who was a kind of occultist and had some extraordinary, peculiar ideas. Ludendorff, for example, took part with Hitler in the Munich beer hall putsch, 1923. But he saw that you had to promise democracy, however insincere you might be, in order to counter the Allied claim after the February Revolution in Russia that they were fighting for democracy against the German dictatorship. So here, military necessity, the aim of boosting morale, firing up people's commitment, drove political reform. The February Revolution in Russia aimed on similar lines to increase military performance, boost domestic production of arms and ammunition by securing a greater commitment to the war on the part of the masses by involving them more in the government. In Austria-Hungary, the death of the aged Emperor Franz Joseph in November 1916, he'd been on the throne since 1848, brought his grandson Karl VI to the throne. He, knowing the situation was now dire, tried desperately to save his empire by negotiating a separate peace with France. The Germans got rid of this and effectively took over Austria, alienating the population of the empire and hastening its disintegration. In Britain, Asquith gave way in December 1916 to the far tougher and more determined figure of Lloyd George. And in 1917, the leadership of the French war effort was taken over by Georges Clemenceau, a similarly tough and uncompromising figure. So in a space of a few months then, the political situation was transformed. There's Carl VI, there's Lloyd George, and there's Clemenceau. Now, by this time, despite Woodrow Wilson's idealism, winning the war had become an end in itself. So military necessity was trumping politics. In Russia, the Bolsheviks under Lenin were determined to end the war because they knew it could no longer be effectively fought. The German military leadership, benefiting from the huge transfer of large numbers of troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front after the defeat of Russia, launched a massive spring offensive in 1918 that pushed the Allied forces back, as you can see here, but failed in the end to dent their morale, and the advance ran out of steam. Generals of the First World War failed to realize on all sides that, to put it simply, the invention of barbed wire in 1874 and the portable machine gun a decade later decisively tilted the balance of warfare towards the defensive side. The examples of easy victories in the colonial wars, which so many generals had participated, were still fresh in their minds. Bismarck's quick and triumphal wars of the 1860s were the model, but the First World War, unlike these earlier wars, had become a war between peoples as much as between armies, a war of attrition in which the combatant nation with the richest resources and the best organized system for exploiting and deploying them was going to win. And here we are, war between peoples, this kind of extremely violent and hostile kind of cartoons expressed attitudes that were not there in the war between France and Germany in 1870, for example. By the summer of 1918, Germany and Austria were exhausted. Russia was out of the war. American supplies and troops arriving in large numbers. And most crucial of all, Ludendorff realized the Allied production of tanks, the armor that was clearly going to turn the balance of war in favor of the offensive side again, was going to outstrip that of Germany many times over in 1919. It was mainly because he knew that the Allied side would have thousands of tanks in 1919, against which the defense of the machine gun and the barbed wire and the trench would not work. That's why Ludendorff realized the war was lost and sued for peace. Well, with the end of the war, politics returned. But in the peace settlement that followed, it clashed fatally with military considerations. Driven by Wilson, the negotiators established the League of Nations and applied the principle of national self-determination, which by 1918 had become a means of hastening the war's end, again, for military reasons, by pushing forward the breakup of the Habsburg Empire, war steering politics again. The successor states were unstable, economically weak, prone to quarrel with one another. They contained significant national minorities that were another source of political instability. Despite the efforts of the French, they were unable to form an effective barrier in Eastern Europe to potential German expansionism. Nor could the new Europe establish enough economic and political legitimacy to save democracy. The new world of Wilsonian democracy had given way by the mid-1930s to dictatorships almost everywhere apart from Czechoslovakia and in Scandinavia, and to bilateral and secret diplomacy between individual states. Treatment of Germany in the peace settlement was largely dictated by the French desire to prevent another German bid for military supremacy, which ensured that the German army was restricted to 100,000 men, tanks, warships, and combat aircraft were banned, France got Alsace-Lorraine back, territory was carved off for the new state of Poland, a large reparations bill was imposed on the defeated nation to pay for the damage caused during 4 years of occupation of Belgium and northern France. This did not, however, in the end, fatally weaken Germany. It did store up widespread and bitter resentments that Hitler and the Nazis were only too able to exploit when the financial and economic crash of the Depression drove Germany into Hitler's arms in the early 1930s. The peace settlement strengthened the British and French empires by transferring to them many of the colonies of the defeated powers, Germany and Africa and the Pacific, the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East. The British Empire actually reached its greatest extent after the First World War, and it was still the predominant strategic consideration in the minds of British politicians at this time. In Britain, the war was rightly remembered as a war fought by the empire as a whole. Hence, for example, the absence of all Christian symbolism in the National War Memorial, the cenotaph, in recognition of the multi-faith character of the empire. The rise of Hitler, remilitarization of the Rhineland, the Anschluss of Austria, all these seemed little local difficulties by comparison with the primacy of the empire and Britain's strategic thinking. Thus, when confronted with the possibility of war, when Hitler threatened to invade Czechoslovakia in 1938, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain exclaimed in a radio broadcast to the British people, "How horrible, how fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing." That was Czechoslovakia. A few hundred miles away, he would not have said that over a similar quarrel in India or Australia. For Clausewitz, war was politics pursued by other means. For Hitler, politics was war pursued by other means. From the start, he intended to tear up the peace settlement, rearm, and fight a new war, this time for European domination, far beyond anything previously dreamed of by the Kaiser. Hitler's war was from the outset a racial war fought against supposedly inferior groups who were to be ruthlessly exploited and killed in huge numbers. The general plan for the East of 1941 envisaged up to 45 million Slavs being exterminated. Hitler saw the Jews as Germany's principal enemy, steering from behind the scenes the joint war effort of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, an extraordinary paranoid fantasy. Hitler's war was an attempt to refight the war of 1914-18, but with radically different means. He wanted from the outset to recreate the spirit of national unity in the people's community, proclaimed by the Kaiser in August 1914, and to avoid what he saw as a stab in the back by Jewish revolutionaries, that his war, in his view, had caused Germany's defeat in 1918. It was the other way around. Of course, the defeat came first in the revolution, and then the revolutionaries were not Jewish. Hitler remembered the First World War as a humiliating defeat that had to be avenged. It was without doubt a military victory for Britain, the British Empire, and Britain's allies, but it wasn't a political victory. It left major issues unresolved. It brought new threats into being. It unleashed unprecedented forces of violence and extremism, leading directly to the rise of fascism and Nazism, anti-Semitism, dictatorship, not least communism in Russia, and beyond that, death and destruction on an enormously greater scale over the following decades. Now, when we look beyond Britain, it becomes clear that the First World War was the Pandora's box of the 20th century, letting loose unparalleled evil and destruction on the world. Thank you very much.